on BBC One over Breakfast with Frost.
Hello, good morning and welcome to Breakfast with Frost. After the first strike by firefighters in 25 years, a deal seems as far away as ever in this increasingly bitter dispute. But with an 8-day strike planned to start on Friday, the pressure is on the unions, the employers and the government to find a solution. We'll be talking to the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, the man at the centre of the crisis. In Nigeria this week, some of the world's most beautiful women arrived for the start of the Miss World pageant. But some of the competitors have stayed away in protest because a Nigerian woman has been sentenced to be stoned to death. Her crime? Committing adultery. We're joined in the studio by the woman who's leading the Miss World boycott, Miss Denmark. The Bank of England has warned of the dangers of the continued rise in house prices, and there are some big question marks hanging over the economy. So we'll be talking to the man who has all the answers, we hope he's got all the answers, the Governor of the Bank of England, Sir Edward George. And talking of money, we're joined live from the quayside in New Zealand by the man who spent more than 20 million out of his own pocket to try to win for Britain's yachting's greatest, biggest prize, the America's Cup. And we'll be reviewing the Sunday papers with that fascinating duo, Joan Bakewell and Ken Follett. But first this morning, a news summary. And at the news desk is Moira Stewart. Good morning, Moira.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Good morning to you. 5 people have died after a coach overturned on the M25 in Buckinghamshire. The coach was bringing people back to the Worcester area after a trip to France.
Returning from a trip to France on a quiet night in good driving conditions, the 57-seater coach left the motorway and tipped onto its side. Emergency crews rushed to the scene between junctions 15 and 16 of the northbound M25. Those who died in this accident and the 38 injured who were helped from the wreckage were thought to have been heading home to the Worcester area.
Police attended within 15 minutes and found the coach you can now see behind me lying on its side with numerous casualties. As a result of the incident this evening, 5 people have been confirmed dead at the scene by doctors. Other casualties have been taken to hospital, which number 38.
The northbound carriageway is now clear and the coach has been dragged out of the field, put on the back of a low loader and driven away up the motorway. Police say they're taking it to a police compound where further investigations will take place. The injured have been taken here to Wexham Park Hospital in Slough and to Hillingdon Hospital. Most are said to be walking wounded, but some are in a serious condition.
We've received 28 casualties. Of those, 2 are seriously injured. 1 has already been admitted to the intensive care unit. A further 4 have been admitted to the hospital with cuts and wounds that are quite severe. A number of patients have now been treated and are ready to leave, and we would expect further patients to be ready to leave the hospital later this morning.
Questions are being asked about how this could happen. There were 2 drivers on board and no other vehicle was involved. Firefighters had to use specialist cutting equipment to free a number of people from the wreckage. The accident took place little more than a day after the end of the fire strike. John Sudworth, BBC News, on the M25 near Slough.
Scotland Yard says 3 men from North Africa have been charged with offences under the Terrorism Act. It won't comment on claims that the security services have foiled a plot to carry out a poison gas attack on the London Underground. Well, our Home Affairs correspondent, Margaret Gilmore, joins me from Scotland Yard. Margaret, what are the police saying about the arrests?
We're talking about 3 men of North African origin. They were being investigated in a joint investigation involving MI5 and anti-terrorist officers. They were arrested for possession of false documents, which the police believe were going to be used for terrorist activities. Now, they're facing extremely serious charges here. Police believe that it was not just planning, but also they were commissioning terrorist acts. However, they are very keen to stress, and I've just been speaking the last few minutes to all sorts of people involved, that they were not caught in the act of planting something on the underground. They were not caught with any chemicals. They have not found any bomb-making equipment. Police investigating this at the moment are looking at a wide variety of possible scenarios that these people were in the very early stages of planning.
And away from this particular case, how worried are the security services about the general threat of an attack?
They're very worried. The threat is very real. As of 10 minutes ago, they said there was no specific target that they were aware of. But since the summer, the number of intelligence reports being intercepted by the agencies, by anti-terrorist officers, has increased massively. They know that Al-Qaeda is regrouping. They know that bin Laden wants to attack the UK. He said it himself in that tape recording last week, which is widely regarded to be genuine. They also know that Al-Qaeda wants to inflict mass casualties. The tube is one possible scenario, but there are all sorts of other scenarios that must be looked at. And in fact, what I'm hearing this morning is that were they, and there's no information to suggest this is the case, but were they looking at an attack on the tube, that would be simply to incite fear in people. It would be almost a psychological attack, because actually they don't, as yet, as far as the intelligence services know, have the capacity to do an awful lot. They're not that sophisticated in chemical weapons.
Margaret Gilmore, thank you. Security officials in Kuwait have arrested a man suspected of being a senior member of the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. Newspapers in Kuwait claim he'd been plotting to blow up a hotel used by Americans in the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. They also allege that he's confessed to being involved in an attack on a French oil tanker off the Yemeni coast last month. Israeli troops have arrested dozens of Palestinians and taken control of strategic buildings in the West Bank city of Hebron. The move is in response to Friday's attack by Palestinian gunmen, which left 12 Israelis dead. Nearly 300 people in northeast Scotland are waiting to return to their homes after being evacuated because of severe flooding. Residents of Elgin in Moray were worst hit after the River Lossy burst its banks. Water levels are now falling after an improvement in the weather. That's it so far. I'll be back at just before 10 with the headlines. Now it's back to you, David.
It's a date. Thank you very much indeed, Maura. And now for our review of the Sunday papers. I think these are the last editions, but there's no reference in here to what we heard there about the tragic coach crash, because I think that none of you have got that in the papers.
Too early.
But here we have the Mail on Sunday, tube nerve gas plot, which we were just hearing about. Myra's cruel secret. Sunday Express, News of the World, Myra Hindley's last words, and Halle Berry from the new Bond film. The Independent on Sunday goes with the terrorist tube gas plot foiled, although as we were just hearing, that apparently was in the early stages. MI5 foils poison gas attack on the tube. The People leads with the EastEnders sex shame there, and the Sunday Telegraph has the three charged over the plot. England's triumph over the Aussies, not of course at cricket, and over here Army blocks plan to cross picket lines. Well, that's the scene this morning, and with us to review the papers we have that magnificent renowned broadcaster Joan Bakewell, who's been the thinking man's crumpet for 35 years at least. Magnificent. And Ken Follett, best-selling thriller writer, good to have you.
The thinking man's airport novelist, I've been called.
Oh, very good.
I think we're a good team.
Very well put. Joan, lead us off.
Well, Myra Hindley is the big story, and how people are going to cover it is interestingly divergent in different papers. The tabloid editors all know that a picture of Myra Hindley on the front of a paper always put up sales. So this is a big selling story, and a lot of people will want to hear a great detail of the story, told yet again with as many details as possible. But there is a scoop here. I think it's a scoop in the Daily Star, which is a new photograph of Myra Hindley with Ian Brady. And that has never been seen before. So that, in journalistic terms, is an absolute coup. The coverage, of course, tends to be more virulently emotive in the tabloids, full of talk of evil, quite appropriately, and passionate hatred. For me, the tensions between this appalling woman's life and the more rational attempts of the law to deal with her, best summed up by Nikki Gerard in The Observer, where she speaks of the tension that exists between, you know, the passionate hatred of this woman's appalling crime and the agenda of the law, which is to punish, and then when the sentence has been fulfilled, to release her. Could we release her? We should. No, we can't. It's an absolutely classic dilemma. You can't do right for doing wrong. Nobody would ever have agreed what should happen to her, and now the story is closed.
Yes, funny you said the story's closed and that it's always been a big seller, the Myra Hindley story. I wonder if this weekend it is, because I know my reaction yesterday morning when I saw the papers was to go through pages 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 and get on to the rest of the news. But I mean, maybe I'm untypical there. Ken?
I knew somebody who covered, I mean, this case was before my time as a journalist, but I knew an older journalist who'd covered it and who really never got over it. He was a sub, and he remembered going through the copy and crossing out all the stuff in evidence that couldn't be in those days published in a newspaper. And he just, it had an effect on him which he really, it sort of scarred him. He always felt the horror of that was always with him all his life.
I do think that the details of the funeral, cremation and so on should perhaps be withheld or kept very low key, because there is a tendency for the papers, by hunting down this final moments and where the ashes will be strewn, to hype up rather passionately involve people to go and be there and see it and sort of relish in some enormously revengeful way what's happened. And I think all that should just now, this has been a terrible story and it will never be forgotten. It now joins the story of the West, and you know, it goes back to Jack the Ripper, of appalling crime, but the death is now happened and the ashes should be scattered in secret.
On to another topic, Kenneth.
Well, I always like it when the papers run stories that you know are not true. And of course, the MI5 story on the front page of the Sunday Times, as we've just heard on the news, just isn't true. From the picture, there's a picture of rescue workers in protective clothing helping somebody who's lying on the ground. So you would think that this poison gas attack has happened. Of course, it hasn't. It's a picture of some exercise. And these people who were arrested didn't actually have any poison gas. They didn't have any ingredients for poison gas, and they weren't planning an attack on the tube. So the whole story, so why has this story happened? These guys were arrested 8 days ago, and they appeared in court on Tuesday. How come this appears in the Sunday Times on Sunday morning? I think the answer is this is a little bit of self-congratulatory publicity for MI5. I think MI5 gave the Sunday Times this story and got the credit for arresting these guys themselves. Of course, MI5 have been at a bit of a loss to know what to do ever since they stopped tapping Joan Bakewell's phone and Patricia Hewitt's phone and Harriet Harman's phone, all that sort of thing that they used to do in the 70s. They're a bit without a role, and I think they're trying to pretend that they're great at catching terrorists. I don't buy it. And it's interesting that the tabloids, I think the later editions pick the story up. The Sunday Mirror, cyanide tube plot, see page 11, all over the front page, sex scandal. The People, Osama's cyanide tube plot, page 11, all over the front page, EastEnders sex scandal. So we know that the British press still has its priorities right.
Right, and we should add to that the back pages of the papers today, two big stories in most of them. Beck's, who's out for 6 weeks with a broken rib, and Thierry Henry's wonder goal of the season, but hopefully David Beckham will be fit for the next England match. What have you got there, Joan?
Well, the firefighting story goes on, doesn't it? The strike. The interesting thing is the tension between the politics of how you get what you want, and Andy Gilchrist has gone for 40%, and everybody sort of knows that he must have known that wasn't going to happen. By being intransigent, he's got himself into a hole. There is sign. I don't think it seems to be that the situation is getting worse because the talks are going on. I think the public now think that an 8-day strike is unacceptable. And I think the coverage of it is appropriate. I mean, I think it's going forward. I don't think it's anything like the state of the unions in the 70s, but there's no doubt about it that a new group of younger militant leaders are coming forward in the unions. And we will have these kind of tensions.
The interesting thing is how the vote of the public has changed. The YouGov poll today has them saying 75-25, that the firefighters are risking lives unnecessarily, and 75-25, roughly the same thing for the fact that the police and the army should go in and get out the red engines. But those are two changes from a few weeks ago.
Yes, the engines aren't on strike, after all. The red engines belong to the public.
Yeah, absolutely right.
I went to see Michael Moore last night at the Roundhouse, and he said one of his gags was, would you run into a burning building for £8.50? And I think, you know, that's our visceral reaction to this. These guys do something that's very dangerous. It's almost as if no amount of money would be enough, and that's what Michael Moore said. I wouldn't do it for $20,000, he said. But on the other hand, this strikes me as old-fashioned trade unionism. You know, to take a union up to the point of this public confrontation with the government, it's got an awfully 70s feel about it. And I wonder about the quality of generalship here. You know, the last time this happened, Arthur Scargill did this. He destroyed his union and he destroyed the British coal industry. And I'm not sure that this is the smart way to improve conditions for firefighters.
Very good. And a last thought too from you,
Well,
Graham.
there's a funny story here. Well, it's tragic too, but it's a government initiative last year, the New Roads and Street Works Act, which was to fine utility companies for digging up the road, for every hole in the road that wasn't filled in time. So instead, it's resulted in lots more holes because they dig smaller holes and they dig them more often.
and now they know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall.
Thank you both. Joy to have you with us. A million thanks. To them both. Now, what sort of weather can we expect today? Well, with us in the weather studio is Penny Tranter. Good morning, Penny.
Good morning, David. It's quite mixed across the country today. Many places are going to be quite dry and bright, but for much of England it's a rather more cloudy and misty story with some outbreaks of rain. Now on Monday we see an east-west split. It'll be foggy in the east, but for the west it'll be cloudier with some outbreaks of rain. And then by the middle part of the week, that wet and windy weather is established right across the country. So for this morning then, many places dry and bright. Some coastal showers around western and northern areas, but really the thickest cloud across England with some showery pockets of rain. Those continuing here this morning, and by this afternoon they'll be confined mainly to East Anglia and the southeast. Elsewhere we can see a lot of dry and bright weather around with some sunshine. But temperatures not particularly brilliant, quite cold in Scotland after quite a hard frost last night. Even in the south, not as warm as of late. Temperatures at best around at 7 to 9. But it looks like being quite good at rugby playing weather at Lansdowne Road between Ireland and Fiji. Now by the end of the night we'll see thicker cloud across Northern Ireland, western and northern Scotland with some outbreaks of rain. That rain continuing here on Monday, coming into parts of Wales and the southwest. Ahead of it, it will be quite a cold and misty start with some local fog, but it should be mainly dry here, and we'll see a little bit of brightness and a little bit of sunshine too. Now back to you, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Penny. Well, now, as some of the world's most beautiful women gathered in Nigeria for this year's Miss World competition, a less fortunate Nigerian woman, Amina Lawal, was facing a horrible fate. Found guilty by an Islamic court of committing adultery, she's been sentenced to death by stoning. The Nigerian government insists that they will not allow the sentence to be carried out, but some of the Miss World competitors have refused to take part this year in protest. Miss Denmark, Mazia Yule, who is leading the boycott, has joined us here in the studio, and I'm also joined by an expert in Islamic law, Zaki Badawi. Good morning to you. Good morning. And I'm also joined, I'm delighted to say, by Peter, and I was just discussing, he's the Nigerian press attaché, and he will now announce the correct pronunciation of his name. Peter.
Ogbonnaya.
Ogbonnaya. Perfect. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. And let's start with you, if we may, Mazia.
Yes.
What was it that made you take... Well, it must have been a difficult decision, because you had been very excited, presumably, about...
Yes, of course. It was a difficult decision, but I couldn't... I felt it was very wrong that Amina Lawal was going to be stoned. So I decided to stay home, because I feel so sorry for her. And it's a terrible... horrible form for torture she's going through.
And it is very different from the sort of
From
all the
Danish,
glitz
yes.
of a Miss World contest.
Yes.
And how many other people have followed your lead? How many other contestants?
We are not so many. I think we're about 4 countries, 5 countries.
And
I'm actually not
you think
sure.
it'll have... Now, I mean, in fact, the lady in question said yesterday or something she hopes other people would still come and so on.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess she would have been persuaded perhaps to say that.
Maybe I think so. She will, but you cannot be 100% sure that Amina Laval will be free. Her case isn't finished yet, so she can still be stoned. And I think we should boycott it because making this protest to show the world how wrong it is.
Very good. And let me turn to you next, Zaki. What's your reaction to what you've heard and for the stand on principle that Mazia has made?
Well, what I have done, I'm not a follower really of the beauty contests at all. But let me say that as a sort of an expert in Muslim law, I have objected to the sentence. And we have actually made this objection throughout the Muslim world, and we conveyed that to the authorities in Nigeria. One of the things is people do not understand the law. You know, the Islamic law applied this particular sentence really in continuation of the biblical law, the Jewish law. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad applied it to start with to a Jewish couple. When he was in Medina, one worker, a Jewish worker, cohabited or rather slept with his employer's wife, and they both confessed. So they came to Muhammad, whom they agreed to be a lawyer.
But today,
yes.
The Sharia, I mean, what is the status of these punishments in Nigeria? They say that, and then we'll come to Peter, that this won't take place, this stoning will not take place, which obviously
it would need to not take place because of the intervention of the authorities. We, as Muslims, we can say that it is, in fact, not obligatory at all. The rule in the Quran does not mention the stoning at all. And this is the source of law for us.
Right. Peter, turning to you, your government has said that this stoning will not take place. How sure can we be of that?
Yes, because you see, Nigeria is a secular state, and Sharia law applies to the states, some states who choose to go by it. Thereafter, the sentence has been appealed against, and when it comes to a higher court, the decision of the higher court will be respected. Now, the government is not trying to intervene in the judgment of the Sharia court, but there is an appeal against the judgment. And when the judgment of the higher court is heard, the judgment will be applied. It has never happened before that a Sharia, the judgment of a Sharia court is the final thing that happens.
Yes, but there have been a couple of Sharia punishments lately, haven't there? Corporal punishment, not of stoning, corporal punishment. And according to the Independent on Sunday today, Amina is not alone. There are at least 3 other stoning convictions awaiting appeal as well.
Well, nobody has been stoned to death in Nigeria. Nobody.
All right.
We have an example where there has been a judgment on Safiat Mohammed. It was appealed against, and the judgment of the higher court was upheld. It has never happened in any
right.
judgment.
It's never happened. Do you believe it won't happen here?
I believe it won't happen at all, because not on the basis just simply of the appeal court, which of course is had to be respected, but because of our interpretation of Islamic law, which is quite legitimate. We say that it should not apply because it's not mentioned in the Quran. And let me say that quite a number of Muslim leaders have appealed to the people there that should be waived. And the whole point is, if you have a conflict between the Sharia, between the state and the federal government, this is not healthy for a government, not healthy for the judicial system. But what we are doing is to tell our people in Nigeria that the Sharia law does not insist or does not have this particular punishment instituted in the Quran.
So when, Peter, would you say your government will actually step in and remove the threat from Amina?
It is not a question of the government stepping in. It is a question of the law taking its course. when there is a case at the Sharia level and the judgment is opposed, you can appeal to a higher court. The government has no business stepping in. It is a question of allowing the law to take its course.
And that will definitely mean that the stoning won't take place?
Yes.
Well, you've heard, are you reassured by all of this, Mazia, or
Yes, but what afterwards? It's not only a problem in Nigeria, it's also a problem in Iran, where there's just been stoned for 5 people, and more are going to be stoned. So I think it's a problem in the whole world. It's a problem we are going to look on and do something about it. Yes.
Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Absolutely, it's not just one country. Thank you all very much indeed. And now let's take a look at what's happening in tomorrow's BBC Breakfast with Dermot Murnaghan, and for the first time, Natasha Kaplinsky.
David, thank you. We'll have the very latest live from Baghdad as the United Nations Chief Weapons Inspector Hans Blix is due to arrive in the Iraqi capital. Is this the last chance to avert a war?
Also tomorrow, Britain is a country of expanding waistlines. Should we be forced to eat a more healthy diet? We'll be reporting from the place where you're told what to eat and being fat is no longer an option.
And James Bond is back, about to hit our cinemas for the 20th time. I'll be talking to the Oscar-winning Halle Berry, who's over here for tomorrow night's royal premiere.
Lucky you. That's all in Breakfast on BBC One from 6 o'clock tomorrow morning.
See you then.
Thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to that. House prices are continuing to boom across the country, but the Bank of England issued a clear warning to homeowners they're heading for a fall, and the longer the boom goes on, the worse the crash could be. Given that the value of our homes is the main feel-good factor in the British economy, what will the effect of that be? Could we sink into gloom, and more gloom, affecting other major industries? What else is going to happen as well? The man who knows it all, the Governor of the Bank of England, Sir Edward George, is here. Eddie, good morning.
Good morning, David.
Given the difficult situation economically in the world at the moment, how are we doing compared to the rest of the world? How are we doing compared to other countries in Europe and beyond?
Well, we were actually one of the very few countries in the world that avoided negative growth during the course of last year. Only just, but nevertheless we managed to keep things moving forward just about. Because you're absolutely right that the key to our current situation is the weakness of the world economy. I think we're past the worst. I think we're seeing in the United States a gradual recovery. Growth in the third quarter was 3% up on the third quarter a year ago, and I think that that gradual progress will continue. I think the prospect in Europe is probably for more modest but positive growth, and the prospect in Japan is more uncertain still. So we are in a difficult international environment, though I think it's improving. And that's the context for our policy posture in this country, where to offset the weakness of the world economy, we've had to actually encourage domestic demand growth. And in this environment, that's meant consumption. And inevitably, that's meant low interest rates, it's meant an increase in borrowing by the household sector, and it's meant this rise in house prices. And that's a concern. If it went too far, then we could have problems later on. I think in your introduction, you talked about a fall in house prices. What we're actually looking for is not a fall in house prices, but a slowdown in the rate of increase, which is quite different.
Yes, well, I think Mervyn King in his statement said that what you were looking for was a situation where we would go over 2 years from 30% rises to 0% rises.
That's right.
And that's what you'd like to see?
Well, yes, I think that's what we think we're likely to see, though there are risks on either side. We may not see a sufficient slowdown, or we may see something which goes beyond just a slowdown in the rate of growth. But our central expectation is that we will actually see slower growth in house prices. And we will need to see that, because there's no question that whatever it is, 25–30% growth in house prices is not sustainable for very long.
And in fact, house prices play a larger part in the British economy than in many other economies, doesn't it? And allied with the fact that we have variable interest rates and so on, it means that it would make life very difficult if we were in the euro at this moment, wanting to adjust our house prices and our interest rates, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, our interest rates will be determined on the basis of the Eurozone as a whole. That's certainly true. And it is also true that we have higher home ownership in the United Kingdom, and therefore the housing market looms larger. We are moving a little way towards fixed interest mortgages, as they have more generally on the continent, and I think over time that's likely to continue. But certainly the impact is not quite the same.
And in terms of growth, do you think that the Treasury will be able to hit the figures that were predicted for growth this year, next year and the year after, or do we have to expect a slight modification in growth?
I think compared with the expectation at the time of the budget, not just the Treasury but we ourselves would have expected stronger global economy and therefore stronger UK economy. I think we have seen some slowdown. It's not huge. And we think that will be the case for the current year. We think now we're back growing at around trend, and we expect that to continue.
What about the situation of Germany today? How worrying is that? I mean, they're not meeting some of their targets in the EU Stability and Growth Pact and so on, and France is a bit close to doing the same thing. I mean, and obviously someone commented there that Germany's breached the rules, but they can't take the measures that we could take because we're not in the euro. But I mean, it makes it more difficult for Germany to evade this recession, doesn't it?
Well, yes, I think the question is, whether that's not something to do with the form and the manner of application of the Stability and Growth Pact itself. I do think in these circumstances where domestic demand growth in the Eurozone as a whole, but particularly in Germany, is exceptionally weak, it's tremendously important, in fact, that the fiscal situation should be allowed to cushion some of the impact of that, so that the automatic stabilizers, the fact that you have slower growth, the fact that you therefore have a larger fiscal deficit, that should be allowed to happen. And indeed, it is provided for in the Stability and Growth Pact. But there are questions of interpretation, and I think the interpretation is in danger of being very rigid. I think in this country it's actually helpful that the fiscal deficit will expand as the economy grows more slowly than anticipated, because that's a buffer, if you like. I mean, it is an automatic stabilizer which is actually helping to support the UK economy. And I think there is a real question about the interpretation and perhaps the specification of the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe.
So maybe Prodi was right that some of the rules in this area of the Stability Pact are stupid.
Well, I don't know about stupid, but it needs to be looked at again, David, I think.
And what about inflation at the moment? People point out it's gone up a little, but it's still below 2.5%. Are you confident about the state of inflation in this country staying below 2.5%?
Yes, I think, one of the very helpful things about the economy in this country is that inflationary pressure is under very good control. We are actually seeing it very close to target at the moment, close below. We're going to see it go above target probably for the next few months, and it may stay there for most of the rest of next year. That's to do with basically oil prices a year ago compared with now, where they're higher because of Iraq and all of that. It's also the case that the rise in house prices gets fed through in the form of housing depreciation. But those are effectively one-off influences rather than sustained upward pressure on inflation. So inflation is under pretty good control, and that's what enables monetary policy to remain supportive of the economy as a whole. So that's not a major issue. I think the recent debate has been more on the downside rather than the upside.
What do you think about, it's almost a year since the Enron scandal broke. What effect has that had on big business worldwide, do you think? I mean, has it had a lasting effect?
It's very interesting. I think the corporate governance and accounting failures, really, in the United States would have caused every company, every accounting firm, certainly in this country, to examine the possibility, could it happen here? And nothing very much has transpired. I don't say it couldn't, but I just say it hasn't. But nevertheless, it impacted confidence in valuations, that impacted confidence in the stock market, and that in turn has had a depressing effect on business confidence. And that effect was indiscriminate. It applied right throughout the world. I do think that we possibly have seen greater stability since the end of September, and I very much welcome that, because I think that was in danger of actually unhinging the global economic prospect, and that would have affected us.
And what about the effect on inflation and everything else? I mean, if the government was, and I know it's not about to do a 40% wage increase for anybody, but if something like a 40% wage increase or a very high wage went through in something like the firefighters' strike, how bad an example would that be for the rest of the economy?
Well, I mean, there has to be a real risk that other elements in the public sector, first of all, would say, me too. And I mean, that would be very difficult to stop if it were allowed to start. So that, I mean, however much sympathy one may have with the conditions of work in different sectors, I think one has to recognize that if we got wage inflation driven by the threat of strike in this way, then that would impact the whole of the economy. We would see not just inflation higher, we would see unemployment higher, and I think it would be very damaging indeed. But happily, that's not for central bankers, that's for politicians, and I gather you've got one speaking to you in a moment.
Yes, who's rather involved in this particular subject. But overall, your message today would be that because of things improving here and improving slowly in Europe and the 3% rise in the United States and all of those things, that contrary to the sort of gloom among one or two of the papers today, your message is a message of hope today, and indeed more than hope, a message of confidence.
Yes, absolutely. I think we're going to see modest progress internationally. I think that will be a helpful environment for the UK. I think we will at some point need to see a moderation in the rate of growth of consumer spending, hopefully a pickup in business investment. And I think that's quite possible without generating inflationary pressures. I have to say that there are risks and uncertainties around that central expectation, but that's the prospect that I see.
And given what you were saying about the Treasury earlier and what we were saying that just there, you don't see a danger of a black hole in the middle of our finances?
Oh no, not a serious black hole. I think our finances are in much better shape than most other countries in the world. I think our debt to GDP ratio in particular is exceptionally low by international standards. I think the medium and longer term pressures from aging population, which is common everywhere, they are less in this country. So that, I mean, there are kind of tactical questions, but I think the Chancellor's got a certain amount of room for manoeuvre, and I'm sure he'll use it sensibly.
Still got some room for manoeuvre?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you very much, Eddie, for being with us today.
Thank you too.
We always enjoy
pleasure.
your visits. It was a great joy to have you here as ever. Yacht racing has been described as being like standing under a cold shower tearing up £50 notes. Well, that's certainly true when it comes to the world's most prestigious yachting competition, the America's Cup. Peter Harrison is the man who spent more than £20 million of his own money paying for the first British challenge in 15 years. And he joins me now live from the quayside in Auckland, New Zealand. Peter, good morning or good evening.
Good morning, David. It's good evening here, of course.
Absolutely. What's the latest news on the progress in terms of the eliminator races?
We've been out on the water today, but the weather's been too strong, so no racing today. And at the moment, we're in the quarterfinals against New York Yacht Club Team Dennis Conner. They've got 3 races, we've got 1. And it's the best of 7 or first to 4. So the next race is obviously a must-win, and we've got 3 to go.
And when is the next race, Peter?
Well, subject to weather, it's not good forecast tomorrow, I understand, and probably, so it could be Tuesday or Wednesday.
And tell us about the boat itself, because in fact, you've got two boats there, haven't you?
I've got two boats. I mean, I had sold my businesses in August 2000, and I decided to give myself a new project. I'm a sailor myself, not at this America's Cup level, so I decided to put a Great Britain team back. I mean, we haven't been in it for 15 years. We've now got 119 people in the team, and there's a very, very high technology sort of design element, and we've got 34 sailors. And we've got two boats, White Lightning GBR 70 and White Magic GBR 78.
And in terms of the 119 people and so on, that figure of £20 million, by the end of this challenge, as it were, will the bill be even greater than that?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment we're probably in about 25 mil pounds, of which we have about 3 mil from a number of sponsors, and about 22 from me. So what I've done, my idea was to kickstart the getting of Great Britain back into what I call the World Cup of Sailing. Here we are sailing against the best of the rest of the world, and of course we've had good Olympic success, and I want to build up on those particular skills and capabilities.
So what are the odds for or against? With a score of 3-1, obviously you're the underdog at the moment.
Well, yes, I mean, interestingly enough, we've got two examples. I mean, Team Dennis Conner in 1983, when he was racing Alan Bond's Australia, they were 3-1 up and Australia won 4-3. So everything is still possible in that way. You've still got to win that fourth race. But there's no doubting, of course, it's quite a hard job.
And in terms of the future, do you think if you don't, I guess if you won it this time, you'd certainly want to go ahead, but are you tempted to do it again, Peter?
Yes, I mean, if we won it, it would be an enormous problem, but it'd be a nice problem to have, because it takes a lot to mount a challenge. But the actual benefits to the economy here in New Zealand have been fantastic. So if we were to win it in UK, not necessarily the challenge team get that, but the benefit to the economy and tourism and all the build-up marine industry and so on. But if you look at the examples of New Zealand, it took them 3 times to win, Australia 4 times to win. So really the idea of us coming here the first time and just walking through to win is a very big call. But what I'm trying to do, hopefully, with the performance we've had, we've won 8 races, we've had 2 wins against Stars and Stripes already, that will bring hope to the various partner potential sponsors and so on in the UK, and hopefully on the next challenge I can get continuity and get a joining of partnership with me, and I will take the whole team forward from there on.
And what is the magic of the America's Cup? Is it just like the Champions League, just the biggest of its kind?
In a way, yes. You know, it's rather like people, you know, wanting to buy or build a Grand Prix team and win a Formula One Grand Prix. It's very similar to that because there's more people effectively in the crews and offshore I should say, and in the design team that actually are sailing the boat. Or similarly, I mean, some people, I'm not a horse racing man, but some people spend a lot of money trying to buy yearlings to win the Derby. I'm a sailing guy, I'm an amateur, and it would just be a fantastic pleasure to do well in this America's Cup. We started it, I don't know whether you know the history, David, but we started in 1851. We lost it first time, we've never won it since. So that means to say we know there's a massive mountain to climb. But all the team are doing very, very well.
Well, we wish you all the best with it, Peter. It's a great venture, and good luck with that next vital race. Cheers from here.
Thank you very much. Cheers, thank you very much, David. Good wishes to everybody at home.
I will pass them on. There you are, you have those good wishes from Peter Hauser. Well now, this Friday, as we've been saying, the Firefighters Strike could get serious, but the man at the centre of all this is undoubtedly the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, who joins me now. I'm delighted to welcome you, John, as ever.
Good morning, David.
What about this latest quote, or quotes yesterday and the day before from Mr. Gilchrist, where he said, changed his tune a bit about £40 an hour, and he said maybe £16 an hour would be a place where we could start, and there might be some modernising as well. Is that a breakthrough or not?
I don't know. I don't think it's helpful doing this kind of megaphone industrial negotiations, but it is welcome. Let's say 48-hour strikes taken place. Thank goodness we avoided 10 of those 12-day threats of strike, and we only had 2. Can I just say right at the beginning, though, I'd like to thank those armed forces who did a wonderful job in those 2 days, the police that supported them, yes, and those firefighters who broke away from our picket lines to give assistance and help, and indeed the public, because only something like they would reduce the call-outs at about a third. So that's quite good. Now, I hear in those discussions that General Secretary has said he's coming off his 40%, well, after 7 months, that's very welcome, and I understand it. Secondly, he said that, of course, that he'd like to look at he's got FBU modernisation plans. Well, as we've always made clear, we're quite prepared to make an exceptional case, provided there is a connection between that and the modernisation of the service. And we're reminded of that by the New York pay. I see in the paper and the details that the actual basic pay of the fire union in New York is less than here, and they've accepted 10%. But the difference is they earn more because they've changed their work practices and the way they do things, exactly as George Bain has suggested. Now, if they don't like George Bain's proposals, and they are an important way forward, and the government's positions on that, then bring forward some others, and we'll talk to them about that. The local authority employers, who I meet tomorrow, and indeed will be meeting, I think, the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, I urge them to get down and talk, not walk. And also the public have made clear they don't want this 8-day strike. They want us to continue to talking.
And in terms of the talking, if it was 16% rather than 40% and so on that they want to talk about, is that a reasonable starting point for a discussion on Monday?
Well, not if he's coming along, and I don't want to get into these negotiations. It's between him and the employers, but if I read, depending one press what he said, and I haven't actually talked to him, saying, well, 16% is a starting rate, don't negotiate with me, or indeed the public. They want to sit down at a table and start the proper negotiations. And I think we have to say also, can you take the gun away from the head that there's going to be a strike on Friday, because that's not the way to negotiate. Now, I don't want to continue these negotiations here. I mean, I hope Andy Gilchrist, the General Secretary, has shown an indication to want to talk further. Right, get in those talks, start looking at what happens, and indeed clear up some of the confusion. I hear him saying in the last 48 hours that, you know, the 4% given by the local authorities was actually not available to each fire worker. Well, there's a confusion there. It is available to each one.
And that's what, the 4% plus the 7%?
Well, the 4% was the one offered by the local
Bain.
authority and another couple of things that they had. Then, in addition to that, George Bain came along and said, right, I'll give another 7%, but you've got to talk about some modernisation changes. You know, I've got some of them here. I mean, they're not extraordinary things, but they might know about it. He suggested end the FBO ban on pre-arranged overtime. They ban overtime. End the ban on working together with the retained fired workers. I mean, I don't know. To me, they don't seem so substantial. Every local authority worker in the last couple of years has had to modernise their work practices in order to get a better deal. And they settled a few months ago for 4%. So, you know, what's at stake here, as Eddie George was reminding us, if you get wage inflation, you say, right, I'm going to go for 16, 40% or whatever it is. Other workers come along, like the nurses and the teachers, and they say that. And every time we lift up this wage level, we're back to the old practice. Instead of having 200,000 extra workers in the public service, we'll make them unemployed. Your mortgage will go up because the interest rates and the borrowing goes up. We've had enough of that. We've got a stable economy. We're putting more services into the public services. So the fire people, yes, they want a fair deal, but it's a fair deal for the rest of the public sector workers as well, and a fair deal for the ordinary people in this country who want the public services, want low mortgages, and they want the high levels of employment that we've got better than any other country.
So you wouldn't, however, you would not, John, rule out discussing the figure of 16%?
That's not for me at all. It's for, our rules are quite clear about this. You've got a certain amount of money that we've given you to the local authorities. You can negotiate within that, and they've done that. If that's not sufficient and you want more resources, like every other workforce, you've got to face some change in working practices. What George Bain did was to show some of them. And now, I know it made the people angry. I went in to see my fire station, knocked on the door yesterday and said, can I come and see you? And you got something to say to me. And we had a good exchange. They don't want the 8-day strike, but they do support their union. They want a fair deal. You only do that by discussing it at the table, not via the papers. So whatever figures you've got in, get in and talk, but bear in mind there is a connection between modernising work practices and the payments that can be made. Otherwise, you push that cost not onto the reorganisation, you push it into the rest of the community, which goes higher unemployment, higher mortgage payments, and that is unacceptable.
Are there any circumstances, John, John, in which, in order to achieve peace, that there was a settlement, but the settlement was more than the 11% over 2 years, and so the employers couldn't afford it. Is there any government money available to tide them over a difficult year or two?
Well, I have to say to you that George Baines made clear there's quite a lot of money in the modernisation process, and you have to go into discussing that. Now, what has been said to the Fire Brigade Union is go in and discuss these proposals, some of them which you agree with, but they don't want to talk about Bain. They've rejected Bain and not even consider it. I understand some of the anger. I heard some of it yesterday. But all I'm saying to them, go in and negotiate. They might like some, they might not like others. They can walk out if they don't. But isn't that a better way of doing it? Now, if they come along and say, look, this is going to cost, let's take the 40% one, which is going to cost £500 million. We don't have that kind of money. We will not pay that kind of money. But please, sit down and negotiate.
And what about the situation? You said there, please don't point a gun at my head, which is a clear request. But if, in fact, the next 8 days...
It's not my head, it's the community's head we're talking about, and it's the local authorities who are negotiating. If you've got complex agreements on modernisation, say the Fire Brigade Union bring their proposals forward, you can't just discuss them in 1 or 2 days and knowing there's a strike on Thursday or Friday. And to be honest, they did accept that before the Fire Brigade. You remember when they wanted those 2 48 hours, they cancelled it. Then the 8 days went down to 2. So they have showed goodwill to do that. And what we've got to encourage them is to now step back. Let's all act responsible and talk, because the public in this country don't want another day's strike.
Right.
The firemen don't want another day's strike, but they want a fair deal, but fair to all.
If people want that, would there be any government money available to help a settlement take place? Additional government money to what the employers have now?
You know, David, in negotiations, there are all sorts of factors that change, and it's not government money. You may change all sorts of things around the timetable of something. They've already proposed one timetable. George Bain proposed another. There are a number of factors involved in it. You can still meet it and meet the government's requirement that it will have to be funded, not by extra money from the taxpayer, but will have to be funded by a modernisation proposal. And Bain has shown that there's quite a lot of resources there. And for I can see, the New York firemen did that years ago, and that's why they're earning more, even though their basic is less.
What about the situation we've read a lot over this weekend about in the next strike, if there is one, will you organise a way in which the red engines can be protecting the lives of the people by either the police going through the picket lines, or the army going through the picket lines, or the police going through the picket lines and handing them over to the army?
Yeah.
Will you, given that that would be a pistol to your head, will you do that?
That's the fertile imagination of some of the press. In all civil situations, you use police, not military, don't you? I mean, the miners' strike just reminded all the difficulties that came for that. They didn't bring troops in, they brought in that. Secondly, all the fire engines or extra fire engines that are needed, we've already got access to quite a considerable amount of them. We were looking at that weeks ago, right? The constraint is not how many vehicles. The constraint is the trained kind of manpower is necessary to man them. Now, we will have, if this strike comes next time, enough of them around, spread around the regions, because they have certain advantages even if you just move them there without the specialised people, just drive them there. You've got a ladder that can go to 2 floors instead of 1, and the fire brigade union don't object to that. You've got extra water. So we are looking how they'll be placed at the region, so the military command itself can make a decision how they may be used in certain circumstances.
So they will be used in certain circumstances?
Yes, they're already distributed. I'm calling them red goddesses because we'll have a green line on them to separate them. But you don't need, therefore, to make some assault in a dramatic way that the press talk about to take them out of the fire stations, because just do remember, if it's a 48 strike, those firemen were out within 1 minute as soon as the 48 hours is up. I want them out to give us the fullest service, and you have to get a balance between those situations. And what is the kind of the imagination of the press that what should happen in that is not necessarily the way you go. But I've made it clear, the House, so's the Prime Minister, we will always do what's necessary for public safety.
But what about, in fact, what Reagan did with the air traffic controllers? If this strike went on, you could sack the lot and get another 50,000 people in to do the job, because there's a huge queue of people wanting the job.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's a way to settle industrial relations matters. You know, I was pressed in the House of Commons, why don't you take legislation right away? It's a matter of balance here. You hope you can negotiate your way out. Take the first 12 days. We were able to get a negotiated situation. I was able to persuade them down to 2 days rather than 12. If you look at the amounts of deaths, tragically as they are, and multiply by 10 or 12. Each day you save is worth doing. If you get an intractable situation where you go in with the law and don't solve anything, all that does is inflame a situation. It's a difficult balance, but when it's a fire strike, you're talking about lives, not inconvenience, and I will always be motivated by the sanctity of life.
Do you think there's going to be a case, though, to make certain organisations like the firefighters ineligible to strike?
Well, I hear those arguments. You've got to remember the firemen haven't been on strike for 25 years, and they got a settled agreement back, funny enough, in 1977. And I'm sure we're going to have to settle this by negotiation. They don't want to strike. You've only got to talk to the fire people. I was talking to them in my fire station yesterday. You know, they're as concerned about life as you and I are. It's a real dilemma for them. We saw that when they got off the picket lines. Now we're talking about decent people who want a fair deal under fair circumstances, and I've got to say it's got to be fair for all.
And as a postscript here, how did you react to the danger allegedly in the paper of the 3 people who've been arrested over the cyanide gas?
Well, it's excited the press. I mean, the facts are, clearly your people doing the papers said 3 people have been arrested, and there's no evidence whatsoever of bombs or gases in that circumstance. It's been elaborated on by the press. I leave them to sell their newspapers. But as the Prime Minister reminds us, we get an awful lot of intelligence that we have to make judgments about. In this case, it doesn't appear to be that there is any evidence whatsoever there's going to be a gas attack or indeed use of bombs regarding the 3 people who've been arrested.
Right, at that point we'll get an update on the news headlines and then come back to John Prescott. Moira.
Thank you. Good morning. 5 people have been killed and up to 40 injured in a coach crash on the M25 west of London. The coach was returning to the Worcester area from France when it overturned a number of times, ending up on its side in a field near Slough. Driving conditions at the time were said to be good. Scotland Yard says 3 men from North Africa have been charged with offences under the Terrorism Act. It won't comment on claims that the security services have foiled a plot to carry out a poison gas attack on the London Underground. The men have already appeared before magistrates in central London. They're due back in court tomorrow. The Governor of the Bank of England, Sir Edward George, has warned that the firefighters' employers should not give in to the union's 40% pay demand. Speaking earlier in this programme, Sir Edward said it would fuel wage claims throughout the public sector and cause great difficulties for the economy.
However much sympathy one may have with the conditions of work in different sectors, I think one has to recognise that if we got wage inflation driven by the threat of strike in this way, then that would impact the whole of the economy. We would see not just inflation higher, we would see unemployment higher, and I think it would be very damaging indeed.
That's it from me this morning. Round the clock coverage continues on BBC News 24, and the next news on BBC One is at midday. Now it's back to you, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Moira. A headline today in the papers here from Mr. Gilchrist: "You will not win. You will not win." What's your reaction to that?
I think you're referring to government, you will not win. I think if you get into that kind of language, you're getting into real difficulties about challenging governments. This is really an issue about a settlement of pay in a fair way. That's the language where talk, not walk. That is the kind of language that leads to walk.
Not, you will not win. Well, we'll follow it very closely in the short course of the following week, and we thank you very much for being with us, as ever. And we thank all our guests, and we thank you as well, of course. All the guests, all of you, top of the morning. Next week, we'll be talking to 2 or 3 intriguing people. As usual, top of the morning. Good morning.